Assalamu alaikum and hello. Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today we're going to be talking about the identity of Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran. The story of Dhul-Qarnayn is mentioned in the Quran, chapter 18, verses 80 through 86 or 87, where the story of Dhul-Qarnayn is associated with the building of the wall and the wall to hold back Gog and Magog. So we're going to be talking about who Dhul-Qarnayn is and responding to some critics of Islam like David Wood and the Masked Arab, who are Christian and atheist, critics of Islam who say that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great and the author of the Quran, which in their view would be Muhammad. Muhammad copied off the Alexander romance, which is a secular myth from the 3rd to 4th centuries. Before I get into who Dhul-Qarnayn is, using historical evidence, let's listen to two critics of Islam. The first critic being the Masked Arab. The Masked Arab is a atheist critic of Islam, a so-called ex-Muslim, or an ex-Shia Muslim, since he claims he was a Shia Muslim, then he became an atheist. David Wood is a Christian apologist, and he's a critic of Islam. So David Wood's a Christian critic of Islam. So these two argue or say that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. So let's listen to what they have to say about Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran, chapter 18, right now.
The of Dhul-Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran was based on the legendary Alexander stories, made up by those who idolize him, not the historical Alexander or any other character.
In Surah 18, Allah tells us that Alexander the Great traveled so far west, well, Dhul-Qarnayn, if you interpret that as Alexander the Great, that he traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. Now, not only can I guarantee you that Alexander the Great never found the place where the sun sets, we know that this was a popular story during Muhammad's lifetime. The story was even circulating in a Syriac work called The Glorious Deeds of Alexander towards the end of Muhammad's life.
So I'll give a few reasons why Dhul-Qarnayn can't be Alexander the Great, and why it's reasonable to hold that Dhul-Qarnayn is Cyrus the Persian or Cyrus the Great. First of all, nowhere does the Quran mention Dhul-Qarnayn as Alexander the Great. So if the author of the Quran, which the critics say is Muhammad, if Muhammad was really writing the Quran or making up the Quran, why would he only use an ambiguous term, Dhul-Qarnayn? Why couldn't he just say Alexander, or use the Arabic name for Alexander, which was Ixander, in the Quran? You see, so when the Quran's mentioning, for example, when the Quran's mentioning Jesus, it mentions Jesus by his titles: Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. All these titles are found in the Quran. So the author of the Quran knew that there were different titles for individual people. So if the Quran was really talking about Dhul-Qarnayn, or if the Quran was really talking about Alexander the Great, then elsewhere in the Quran it would mention that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Why is the author of the Quran using the ambiguous term Dhul-Qarnayn, which is the two-horned Lord, or the two-horned one? So the Quran uses the term Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned Lord, not as an exclusive title to anybody. So it's possible that Dhul-Qarnayn could be Alexander the Great. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm just saying it's unlikely, because if the author of the Quran really meant Alexander the Great, then elsewhere it would mention that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. So why is the author of the Quran ambiguous here? Another problem is nowhere in the Hadith does it say that does the Prophet Muhammad say that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. We Muslims believe in the Quran, and then we believe in the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. For example, the Quran says follow the Prophet Muhammad in several places, such as the Quran chapter 3 verse 164 and the Quran chapter 16 verse 44. So the Quran gives authority to the Prophet Muhammad to teach and make clear the Quran to us. Again, this is found in the Quran chapter 3, verse 164, and the Quran chapter 16, verse 44, etc., etc. So anyways, so the Prophet Muhammad is a good authority to go to when understanding Islam according to the Quran. So anyways, nowhere does the Prophet Muhammad say in authentic hadith that Alexander the Great is Dhul-Qarnayn. So if the critics want definitive proof that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, then they need to provide a authentic hadith from Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, etc., that the Prophet Muhammad said that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, or by the Arabic name Alexander. So far, no critic has provided any kind of authentic hadith identifying Dhul-Qarnayn as Alexander the Great. So that's one thing to keep in mind when talking about the identity of Dhul-Qarnayn. Now, some might say, well, there are early Islamic scholars who say that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, and this is two early Muslim scholars that say Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. It would be Ibn Ishaq, and Ibn Ishaq, pages 138 to 140, and Tafsir al-Jalaluddin. Jalaluddin is a classical Sunni tafsir of the Quran, and Jalaluddin wrote his tafsir in 1459 CE, Christian era, and he identifies Dhul-Qarnayn as Alexander the Great. The problem is that if the critics are using this type of Ibn Ishaq and Jalaluddin, it's a fallacious argument, because they're doing something what's called they're having a fallacious argument. They're using a fallacious argument called appeal to authority. In logic and reasoning, appeal to authority is a fallacious argument where the person is using authority instead of evidence to support his claims or to prove his point. So this is a fallacious argument known as appeal to authority. Another thing I want to add is Ibn Ishaq is not the best source, because there are a lot of problems with Ibn Ishaq's book. Even if you read the introduction section of Ibn Ishaq, there are many early Muslim scholars who spoke out against his reliability. So for those who want to view for those who want to dig deeper into why Ibn Ishaq is not reliable, I'm going to post the video I did last year called Problems with Ibn Ishaq. 6 years ago I made another video explaining the problems with Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari, and 8 years ago I made a video called Problems with Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari. I made 3 videos discussing why Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari aren't reliable in the past 3 years, and I'll link all of them below for those who want to see why Ibn Ishaq is not reliable. So I'll post that in the description below. Well, what about the tafsir? Because the critics will appeal to the tafsir, saying that the tafsir mentions Alexander the Great, or the tafsir mentions that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. So what's wrong with the tafsir? The problem with the tafsir, the problem is not all tafsirs are reliable. And again, this is it's a fallacious argument to appeal to the tafsirs, because the tafsirs aren't necessarily 100% correct. The tafsir, there's according to Muslim scholars, it says that tafsirs are filled with weak stories. For example, Ibn Kamal said that the books of tafsir are filled with hadiths that are muda. Muda means they're fabricated hadith, and things like that. And Muslim Muslim scholars have also acknowledged that tafsirs do contain weak and fabricated narrations. And I'm going to post this below. For example, in Faith al-Qadir al-Shamir Jamil al-Sadair by Imam al-Manawi, Volume 1, page 20, he states that the tafsirs are filled with weak and fabricated narrations. And Ibn Kamal, a Muslim scholar, also said that the books of tafsir are filled with hadiths that are mudab, which means fabricated. Ibn Taymiyyah also said that in these books that a lot of people call the book of tafsirs has a lot of narrations from the old people, and that are lied to them in mere words on Allah and His Apostle, but just a calculated or poetic allegation. So as we can see, not everything mentioned in the books of tafsir is correct, and whatever tafsir al-Jalaluddin or tafsir al-Tabari, even if these tafsirs are mentioning that Dhul-Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, these tafsirs, they aren't 100% reliable. And the source of Ibn Taymiyyah stating that tafsirs aren't generally reliable and they're filled with weak narrations and stuff like that is found in Mujam Fatwa Sheikh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, Volume 6, page 388. And I will post that in the description below, where Ibn Taymiyyah says that the books of tafsir are filled with fabricated narrations, and the books of tafsir contain weak and fabricated narrations. I'll post the reference below. So we can see that tafsirs that Ibn Ishaq and tafsir Jalaluddin, they're not reliable to begin with. So the critics should stop appealing to those sources, because they're not reliable. So then the question really arises: well, if Alexander the Great isn't Dhul-Qarnayn, then who is Dhul-Qarnayn? And it's and it's not true that it's either that the only theory. There's only two theories as to who Dhul-Qarnayn could be: Alexander the Great or Cyrus the Persian, or Cyrus the Great. There are other figures who are identified. There are other theories as to who Dhul-Qarnayn is. For example, some people say that it's Alexander the Great. Some Arabs say that it's King of Himyar, Yemeni king, an ancient Yemeni king. Some say it's Darius the Great. Some Chinese say it's Yu the Great, and even certain Jews say that Dhul-Qarnayn is the Messiah bin Yosef. So Jews, Christians, Arabs, Persians, Chinese, these people all claim that Dhul-Qarnayn is, their own national hero, whether it's Cyrus the Persian, or whether it's Alexander the Great, or the Messiah bin Yosef, or Yu the Great. There's all kinds of theories. On who Dhul-Qarnayn is, and some Muslims even say that it's King Hammurabi, an ancient Israel or an ancient Assyrian king, an ancient Iraqi king who lived in ancient Mesopotamia, which would be modern day Iraq. So there's all kinds of theories as to who Dhul-Qarnayn is, but it's my theory that, and I think the evidence supports that Dhul-Qarnayn is actually Cyrus the Great. And the reason why I say this is because the whole reason, if you read Tafsir ibn Kathir, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, and Tafsir al-Tabari, it talks about why the Quran chapter 18 was revealed. And the Quran chapter 18 was revealed because the people of the book, which would be the Jews in this context, were asking questions to the Prophet Muhammad to tell a story about Dhul-Qarnayn. So the Jews at that time were relying on two sources. They were relying on their written literature and oral reports. So the Jews questioning the Prophet Muhammad were relying on their version of the Old Testament, or their version of the Torah, or the Old Testament, and their version of their oral Talmud. So these Arab Jews were relying on two things: their version of the Old Testament, or their version of the Torah, and their versions of the oral traditions. So it's not correct to say. So when the critics say, well, the Jews were relying only on like oral reports or written reports, it's not true, because the Jews of Arabia were relying on both written and oral tradition, their version of these Jewish stories. So then the question really arises: we need to look at the Old Testament to see who Dhul-Qarnayn is, because again, the Jews were these were questions from the Jews. So if we read the only figure that's connected to two horns is Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Persian. The two-horned was at least familiar to the Jews. This is evident from the fact that they instigated the Meccan unbelievers to ask the Prophet about him. So we must turn to the Jewish literature or oral traditions from the time of Muhammad to find out who this person was, or to establish that, or to establish what was the kingdom known as the two-horned. So if we read the Old Testament, if we read Daniel chapter 8 verse 2 to 7, it talks about the ram with two horns, and that two horn imagery is associated with Cyrus the Great. So that's why I say that Cyrus the Great is Dhul-Qarnayn, because of Daniel chapter 8 verses 2 to 7. And again, the Jews were asking the questions, so the Jews had answers to the questions, and it looks like their answer comes from Daniel chapter 8 verse 2 to 7.
Very similar to the story in the Quran. Is it just a pure coincidence? I mean, so far, both the Alexander myths and the Quran say a man known as the man with two horns traveled all over the world. Both say he saw the sun rising above a people who had no shelter from it. Both say he went to mountains to see a people who were complaining about Gog and Magog. Now the Quran says he used iron and brass to build the barrier to keep Gog and Magog out. So let's see what materials were used in the myth to keep Gog and Magog at bay. Alexander commanded and fetched 3,000 smiths, workers in iron, and 3,000 men, workers in brass. And they put down brass and iron, and kneaded it as a man kneads when he works clay. Then they brought it and made a gate. Now, in the Quran, we also hear that Gog and Magog will break free from their incarceration towards the end of time and cause havoc on earth, an idea supported in the authentic hadiths. The verse says, "Until the Gog and Magog people are let through their barrier, and they swiftly swarm from every hill." Now the Alexander myth also tells us Gog and Magog will be released towards the end of time and also take over the world. When the world shall come to an end by the command of God, the ruler of creation, created things shall anger God, and sin shall increase, and wrath shall reign, and the sins of mankind shall mount up and shall cover the heavens. And the Lord will stir up in his anger the kingdoms that lie within this gate. For when the Lord seeks to slay men, he sends men against men, and they destroy one another. And the Lord will gather together the kings and their hosts which are within this mountain, And they shall be assembled at his beck, and shall come with their spears and swords, and shall stand behind the gate, and shall look up to the heavens, and shall call upon the name of the Lord, saying, O Lord, open to us this gate. And the Lord shall send his sign from heaven, and a voice shall call on this gate, and it shall be destroyed and fall at the beck of the Lord. What we just read also encapsulates this idea in an authentic hadith, which tells us the barrier will be breached after they ask nicely to Allah.
Okay, so now what he is doing is that he is reading verses from Quran and comparing them with passages from Alexander Romans, claiming that Quran copied from Alexander Romans. But did he even tell his viewers from which version of Alexander Romans he is reading? The version which he is reading from is the Syriac version of Alexander Romans, which was written in the 7th century. This version which he is reading from was written in the 7th century after Quran. And here are the evidences from a book named Gog and Magog in early Eastern Christian and Islamic sources, page number 17. The Syriac tradition, it dates from the 7th century. The Syrian redactor, probably an Eastern Syrian Christian, added a certain number to the text. The episode of Alexander's building a wall against Gog and Magog, however, is not found in the oldest Greek, Latin, Armenian, and Syriac versions of the Romans. The barrier episode has not its origin in this text, which clearly means that the story of Gog and Magog in the book of Alexander Romans was added in the 7th century. Also from an article by Tübingen University, it is well known that Alexander appears in the Quran, Surah 18, under the name of Dhul-Qarnayn. This episode is not found in the oldest form of the Greek Alexander Romans. It was only interpolated to it. Interpolated means that it was added. In page 8 of the same source, the legend of Alexander's shutting in of Gog and Magog is also found in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Macedonis, which is interpretation of the Arab conquest. This simply means that it was copied from Quran. This work also was composed in Syriac, sometime in the last quarter of the 7th century. This clearly means that the story of Gog and Magog in the book of Alexander Romans was written in the last quarter of the 7th century after the revelation of Quran. And the source clearly here says that it was interpretation of the Arab conquest. And who were the Arab conquerors? Muslims, of course. So as we can clearly see that this guy is not being honest and should not.
So all those stories about Alexander and the Alexander romance actually postdate the Quran. So the Quran was written, or the Quran was revealed in the 6th century, and those Alexander myths and stuff like that were circulated in the late 6th century. In other words, they postdate the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18. So again, Islamic awareness has a really good response to, the issue of the Quran copying off Alexander romance. It's called On the Sources of the Quranic Dhul-Qarnayn, and this is islamic-awareness.org, where they discuss that even Orientalists weren't sure who the identity of Dhul-Qarnayn was. For example, some Orientalists thought it was Alexander the Great, but other Orientalists thought that it was Cyrus the Persian, or some Orientalists even like Gero, who was a Jewish critic of Islam, or a Jewish Orientalist, I believe. He thought that Dhul-Qarnayn was Moses. So even these Orientalists and these critics of Islam, they weren't sure who Dhul-Qarnayn was. Some of them said it was Moses, some of them said it was Cyrus of Persia, some of them said it was Alexander the Great, some of them said it was a future Jewish Redeemer or Messiah. So, even the critics don't agree who Dhul-Qarnayn is. So some of them do admit it's Alexander the Great, sure. But others hold that he was one of the kings of Yemen, he was Cyrus of Persia, etc., etc. So it's not true that all the critics agree that it's Alexander the Great. Critics are divided on who Dhul-Qarnayn is. But anyways, Islamic awareness shows that, that the Alexander romance was composed after 628 CE. So this means that the Alexander romance was written after the Quran. It was written after the Quran, chapter 18, was revealed. So even these Orientalists, even these critics of Islam admit that the Alexander romance, the Syriac Alexander romance, the Greek version of the Alexander romance, etc., etc., was written after the Quran. It wasn't. It couldn't have been a source for the Quran because it came after
because it came after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18. The Syriac version of the Alexander Romance, etc., etc. So, the critics who say this who admit that the Alexander Romance came after the Quran, after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18, would be B.M. Wheeler in his academic article called Moses or Alexander, Early Islamic Exegesis of the Quran, chapter 18, verse 60 to 65, Journal of Near Eastern Studies, 1998, page 214. So you see these critics, they're not being honest, because a lot of these sources, these so-called sources for the Quran, actually post-date Islam. They actually came after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It's misleading to say that the Quran copied after the Quran copied off of these sources, when most of these sources, most of these so-called Jewish or Alexander Romance or Christian apocryphal sources, many of these so-called sources of the Quran actually post-date the revelation of the Quran. They came after the Quran. They were written after the Quran, and things like that. But one might argue that the Prophet Muhammad actually heard the stories and then he put it into the Quran. They'll admit that these stories were written after the revelation of the Quran or after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, but the Prophet Muhammad heard the story, and he decided to include it into the Quran. But the response to this is that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. If the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, as even the critics and Orientalists say he was, then we must rule plagiarism and knowingly writing the Quran from his own mind out of the question. So just because the Quran mentions stories from before, that doesn't mean that the author of the Quran is plagiarizing these stories. It just means that the Quran is confirming the truth of these stories. Just because the Quran mentions stories about Prophet Moses or David, which are also found in other sources, it doesn't mean it's copied from those sources. It's very possible that these were true stories maintained in the Quran, simply came to confirm their authenticity, especially when we take into consideration that this is one of the functions of the Quran. See the Quran, chapter 5, verse 48. So, Prophet Muhammad was sincere. If the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, then he wouldn't have knowingly plagiarized material and included it into the Quran. So another problem with that is that the Prophet Muhammad taught that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures. The Prophet Muhammad, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the Prophet Muhammad, that Islam teaches that the Bible is corrupt in various places. So the Prophet Muhammad himself said that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures. This is found in a hadith in Musnad Ahmad. This is found in a hadith in Musnad Ahmad, volume 4, page 381, where the Prophet Muhammad said that the Jews and Christians lied about their prophets and distorted their book. That means that the Prophet Muhammad believed that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scripture. So if the Prophet Muhammad believed that Jews and Christians had corrupted versions of their books, or and if you read Tafsir ibn Kathir on the Quran chapter 15, the Prophet Muhammad said that the Jews and Christians have distorted or corrupted their books. Their books being, whether it's the Old Testament, New Testament, or the Old Testament Apocrypha, or the New Testament Apocrypha, or these, rejected books like the Infancy Gospel, the Book of Jubilees, and, the Talmud and stuff like that. So the Prophet Muhammad believed that the Jews and Christians had corrupted scriptures. So if the Prophet Muhammad believed that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures, according to the Hadith and Tafsir ibn Kathir on the Quran chapter 5, verse 15, then why would the Prophet Muhammad plagiarize that stuff. It doesn't make any sense. It would be like me saying, you know, it would be like me saying that the Bible is corrupt, yet I'm copying off the Bible. That doesn't make any sense. So the Prophet Muhammad didn't plagiarize off material because either this material postdates Islam, or there's too many dissimilarities between the source and the Quranic source. For example, there's a lot of differences between the Alexander romance and the Quran's version of the Quran, chapter 18. In the Alexander romance, you know, Alexander decides to build the wall, but if you read the Quran, the people asked Dhul-Qarnayn to build the wall. So you know, it's stuff like that. So, but another thing I wanted to refute was the Masked Arab and David Wood. I'm sorry, the Masked Arab. I don't know if David Wood makes this argument, but the Masked Arab says that the Prophet Muhammad plagiarized off an ancient poem. You know, and that poem shows that Dhul-Qarnayn went so far so far east that he found the sun setting in a spring of warm water, and the Masked Arab said that's the source of the Quran, chapter 18, was this ancient pre-Islamic poem written by Tuba. Tuba was a pre-Islamic Yemeni king. The problem was that that poem is forged. That poem comes from Ibn Ishaq, and it comes from Tafsir, and it comes from the Tafsir literature, but that poem is not authentic anyways. So that poem is actually a forgery. So you know, Ibn Ishaq was accused at his time for including spurious poetry in his book. You know, if you read the introduction to Ibn Ishaq's book, it talks about, you know, forgeries, you know, forged poems in his work. So, you know, that argument doesn't work because that poem is forged. So the Prophet Muhammad didn't plagiarize off some pre-Islamic poem by Tuba, because that pre-Islamic poem actually is actually a forgery. It's not authentic anyways. So the identity of Dhul-Qarnayn is Cyrus of Persia, in my opinion, because Cyrus of Persia is mentioned in the Old Testament. Alexander the Great isn't. The Quran talks about Dhul-Qarnayn being a believer in God and a just man, and Cyrus of Persia fits this. If you read if you read the Old Testament, it talks very well about Cyrus of Persia. And it talks about, for example, if you read Isaiah chapter 44 verse 28, it says that said of Cyrus, he is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to your foundation shall be laid. You know, so in the following chapter, it even goes to call Cyrus of Persia the Messiah. You know, and Cyrus of Persia is further praised in Isaiah chapter 51, or Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1. So this shows that, you know, Cyrus of Persia was a great man of character and is favored by God. And, you know, finally, you know, the book of Daniel chapter 8 verse 22 says, you know, the two horns is associated with Cyrus of Persia. So, you know, so this is further evidence that Cyrus of Persia was Dhul-Qarnayn. You know, because the Jews had a favorable view about him. You know, so Alexander the Great fails this test because Alexander was a confirmed polytheist, and you know, and another problem is that Dhul-Qarnayn, according to the Quran, Dhul-Qarnayn expanded his empire to the northwest and east, but not the south. But Alexander, on the other hand, continuously expanded his empire towards the south. So you know, so that's, you know, that's further proof. For example, Alexander the Great. You know, Alexander the Great was, you know, he didn't conquer the area Cyrus of Persia conquered. Alexander the Great only expanded to the south, while Cyrus of Persia journeyed towards the east. So, you know, and Gog and Magog were already around during the time of Cyrus of Persia, found in Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 39. So Gog and Magog were known by other names like the Huns, etc. They were already around during Cyrus of Persia's time. So this is further proof that Cyrus of Persia is in fact Dhul-Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran. So we have to look at everything, and if you see the tomb, the tomb of Cyrus of Persia, he has two horns, and that's further confirmation that this is that this is Dhul-Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran. So Dhul-Qarnayn's conquest spread to Syria and modern day Turkey in the west and the east. And there's no trace of his expeditions to the north or the south, whereas the Quran makes an explicit mention of his third expedition. So Cyrus of Persia expanded his kingdom towards the north, the east, and the west, not the south like Alexander the Great did. And as regards to Gog and Magog, it's been established that there were tribes of Central Asia who were around at the time of Cyrus of Persia. They were in the north, the east, and the west. Places where Dhul-Qarnayn, or places where Cyrus of Persia was. So Gog and Magog were already around during the time of during the time of Cyrus of Persia. So this is to me is further proof that for example, Cyrus of Persia would have conquered the areas of the Black Sea and the Caspian. So that's where the Quran says the wall was built to protect from Gog and Magog. So, but Alexander the Great never went to those places. Cyrus of Persia did. So that's this is further proof that the Quran is actually mentioning Cyrus of Persia here. And the prophecy. Remember the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8 verse 20, where there's two horns. So this is talking about Cyrus of Persia. It's not talking about Alexander the Great. So in conclusion, the stories of Alexander the Great and Alexander romance actually postdate the Quran and Islam. Thus, the author of the Quran can't be talking about Alexander the Great as Dhul-Qarnayn. And remember the prophecy, or the so-called prophecy in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 20, where it says, "The ram you saw, the one with two horns, represents the kings of Media and Persia." This is associated with Cyrus of Persia. It's not associated with Alexander the Great. As for the wall was built. The Quran is probably talking about the Dariel passage in the Caucasus Mountains. According to local Armenians, this wall was called the Baheg Gorei, which means the passage of Cyrus. So Cyrus of Persia was associated with a wall in the past. Remember, Dhul-Qarnayn expanded his empire in three directions: east, west, and north, which is the same as Cyrus of Persia expansions, where he did not make his southern expansion. Southern expansions began after Cyrus of Persia died. It should be noted that Alexander the Great made his expeditions south and east, not towards the east, west, and north like Cyrus of Persia did. So Alexander the Great was more in the south, while Cyrus of Persia was towards the east, west, and north. So when Cyrus of Persia was making his expansions, he would have definitely ran into Gog and Magog, because Gog and Magog were already around, as seen in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 39, and the wall was built to protect against Gog and Magog. in the Caucasus Mountains, and this wall is called the Darial Passage. So that's further confirmation that when the Quran is talking about Dhul-Qarnayn, it's talking about Cyrus of Persia. It's not talking about Alexander the Great, because nowhere in the authentic Hadith or nowhere else in the Quran does the Quran associate Dhul-Qarnayn with Alexander the Great. That's the first important piece to note. And the second thing to note is that the Alexander romance actually postdates Islam. So how can the author copy something? How can the author of the Quran copy something that came after, that postdates the Quran, that came after the Quran? It makes absolutely no sense. So, and it makes more sense to say it's Cyrus of Persia, because Cyrus of Persia is mentioned in Ezekiel, or I'm sorry, is mentioned in the book of Daniel. He's mentioned in the book of Isaiah and things like that. Alexander the Romance is not mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. So the Jews had a higher regard for Cyrus of Persia over Alexander the Great. But then the question really arises, how did Alexander the Great get associated with Gog and Magog instead of Cyrus of Persia? For example, you can find the story in Josephus' work about Alexander the Great building a wall to protect against Gog and Magog. My theory is that Alexander the Great became more popular than Cyrus of Persia. So the stories of Cyrus of Persia building the wall against Gog and Magog got confused with Alexander the Great and were overtaken. So originally Cyrus of Persia built the wall against Gog and Magog, and things like that. And then later on, these Jews confused that story with Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great was more popular than Cyrus of Persia, in Palestine, and in places like that. So it's possible that that story got mixed up with, or Alexander got mixed up with Cyrus of Persia, when in reality the Quran is fixing the story. It's saying, look, the story is about Cyrus of Persia, it's not about Alexander the Great. So the Jews obviously got their story wrong. It was supposed to be Cyrus of Persia instead of Alexander the Great. So the Quran is correcting this mistaken, story that the Jews had, without naming Dhul-Qarnayn. So Dhul-Qarnayn, no one can disprove that Dhul-Qarnayn is Cyrus of Persia. It's my theory that Dhul-Qarnayn is Cyrus of Persia, and no one can disprove it, because Dhul-Qarnayn actually is found in the Jewish Old Testament and was praised by the Jews, as opposed to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great wasn't, praised in the Old Testament, and again, the Jews were asking the Prophet Muhammad the question, so the Jews had the answer to the question in the Old Testament, which mentions Cyrus of Persia but doesn't mention Alexander the Great. So again, even the critics will admit that the Alexander romance came after the Quran. So I'm going to end this clip, I'm going to end this video with David Wood even admitting that the glorious deeds of Alexander, the source that he says the Quran plagiarized was written during the end of the Prophet Muhammad's life. Thus, the author of the Quran couldn't have plagiarized the source that came after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18.
Circulating in a Syriac work called The Glorious Deeds of Alexander towards the end of Muhammad's life.
So as you can see, even these critics admit that the glorious deeds of Alexander, or the Alexander romance, actually was written after the Prophet Muhammad, or written close to the time of the Prophet Muhammad died. So that means that the Alexander romance, or the glorious deeds of Alexander, were written after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18. Thus, it's impossible for the author to copy a source that was written after the source. So it's impossible for the author of the Quran to copy something that would come in the future, that would come after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18. Even these critics admit it. That this completely refutes the idea that it's Alexander the Great. And the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. If the Prophet Muhammad was sincere, then he wouldn't have knowingly plagiarized stuff and put it into the Quran. Even the critics will admit that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere and things like that. So just because, just because the Quran mentions stories from before, that doesn't mean that the author of the Quran is, plagiarizing these sources for because the Quran says that it simply came to confirm their authenticity. See the Quran chapter 5 verse 48. So I hope this clarifies the confusion on who Dhul-Qarnayn is. Dhul-Qarnayn is Cyrus of Persia. It wasn't Alexander the Great. Thanks, Salam.